Om Sarashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Pariyantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Be seated, please. Okay, good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to the many students attending these classes online. Nice to have you all here. We begin today a new chapter. You know also that we're not taking all the chapters of this Uddhava Gita. It's quite long. It's 2-3 times as long as Bhagavad Gita. So we're taking selected chapters. But we finished chapter 14, and the very next chapter is wonderful. So these 2 chapters we're both taking. In fact, chapter 14, if you remember from our last class, it ended with, in American English, they call it a bombshell. Bombshell means something unexpected happens right at the end. In this case, the last portion of chapter 14, Uddhava asked us a long list of questions, largely about sadhana. What's the difference between a wise person and a fool? What's the difference between sattva-guna and tamoguna? What's the correct path to be taken? What's the path to be avoided? A lot of very specific questions regarding sadhana, spiritual practice. In particular, this discernment between the right thing and the wrong thing. Better, instead of using words like right and wrong, the helpful thing and the unhelpful thing in terms of spiritual practice. And Sri Krishna patiently answers each and every one of Uddhava's questions. And then in the very last verse, bombshell, this unexpected twist, where he says, we've been talking about all this, this discernment between the best thing and the undesirable thing. He says, but ultimately, all this discernment between good and bad is bad. Discernment itself, he says, is undesirable. Not just specific things are desirable or undesirable, but even to discern the difference between desirable and undesirable, he says, is undesirable. He says specifically, where is that? I wrote it down here. Guna dosha drishtihi doshaha. The drishti, the discernment between guna and dosha. Here, guna means a good quality, dosha means a defect. He says that discernment is itself a defect. Gunaha tu ubhaya varjitaha. But what is best, he says, what is the best quality is to be free from both. Now, this is very unexpected to answer at the very end to Uddhava, and we'll see Uddhava's response in just a moment. But before, let's just understand in general what's going on here before we plunge in to the text. What Sri Krishna is referring to here is something he discussed quite a bit in Bhagavad Gita as well, and that is to be guna atita, to be beyond the gunas, to be beyond the three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas, or in this case, to be beyond guna and dosha, that which is a good quality and that which is defective, to be beyond that. And he is describing, both in the Bhagavad Gita and at the end of the prior chapter, he's describing the understanding of an enlightened person. You would expect an enlightened person to utterly transcend worldliness. In the world, we make all these differentiations between that which is helpful for our spiritual practice and that which is not helpful for spiritual practice. But an enlightened person has completed all that spiritual practice. Therefore, what difference does it make if something is helpful or unhelpful for spiritual practice? So we would expect an enlightened person to have transcended all these differences and not need to engage in this kind of discernment. Discernment with regard to sadhana, spiritual practice. The practice is over. But when one is not yet enlightened, like you might be this close, but not quite there yet. So if you're not yet enlightened, should you just throw away all this discernment? Sri Krishna says it's best if you transcend the three gunas. It's best if you discern this discernment between what is helpful for spiritual practice and what is unhelpful for spiritual practice. Remember, he's talking about an enlightened person. Can you, if you're not yet enlightened, this is a nice way to put it, can you practice being enlightened? Is that a spiritual practice? Try it. Right now, let's try being enlightened. What would... I'm being silly. What does that mean, to practice being enlightened? The goal, of course, is to understand how the enlightened person thinks, and to have that kind of thinking present in your mind. It's not a behavior to be practiced. And there's a wonderful story. In fact, there are a bunch of stories about this. The story of the fish, did I tell it in this class or the other one? The other one, so I haven't told here. So those of you who heard it before, forgive me, this is the classic story that shows the problem of imitating a wise person. The behavior of the you say the behavior of the wise person should be imitated because that becomes the spiritual practice for the students. So the story is a guru with his 3 disciples come to the sea, edge of the water, and he wades out into the water and he catches a fish. And the disciples are watching and they're amazed because he takes this fish and he eats it whole, swallows it. Then he catches another one, and another one, and another one. And this way, 5 or 6 fish he swallows whole. Then he comes up on the beach, lays down, and it's night. He goes to sleep. Disciples have watched this whole thing, and they're confused because Guruji has always told us not to eat fish. we should be pure vegetarian. So they say, but he's eating fish. He's enlightened. So if it's okay for him, it should be okay for us. So these disciples went out into the sea. They caught some fish. They came up on shore. They started a nice cooking fire, and they roasted their what do you call it? Machli masala something, I don't know. They made their nice fish preparation. They ate it, and they enjoyed it, and then they went to sleep. Okay. Next morning, Guruji wakes up, goes back to the ocean, stands knee-deep in the water, opens up his mouth, and one at a time, the fish jump out and return to the sea. He was protecting the fish. Somehow, the Guruji had the idea that the fish were going to get eaten by some bigger fish, I suppose, so he was protecting them overnight. They swam around in his belly, presumably, until the morning when he released them. And then after Guruji walked up to the shore, the disciples are watching in amazement. And Guruji turns to his disciples and says, "Now it's your turn." Now, that's a classic story that shows the silliness of imitating the behavior of a guru, an enlightened person. An enlightened person has transcended. There's a recent example of that. Not that recent. Years ago in Rishikesh, there was an unusual sadhu, sannyasi. They called him Dung Krishnananda. Dung. Dung is, you know what dung is. And apparently this Swami Krishnananda was his proper name. He got called Dung Krishnananda because he would sit in a pile of dung and meditate. Sit in a pile of dung and meditate? If you're his disciple, what are you supposed to do? Sit in a pile of dung? No, he was guna atita. He had transcended all. He didn't care if he was sitting on dung or if he was sitting on a golden asana throne. It was all the same for him. He had transcended these distinctions. So now it becomes exceedingly clear that we have to differentiate teachings with regard to, are these teachings intended for an unenlightened person, or are they practices for an unenlightened person, or are they traits of an enlightened person? As students, we have to discern the difference. Are they teachings? And these are completely different. Teachings meant for those who are not yet enlightened, as opposed to teachings that describe the behavior of an enlightened person that has transcended all worldliness. We have to discern context is all important. So what happened at the end of the prior chapter is Sri Krishna suddenly switched the context. The context had been spiritual practice. And it had been for many, many verses, spiritual practice. Uddhava's questions were all about spiritual practice. Sri Krishna's answers were all about spiritual practice up until that very last verse, where Sri Krishna suddenly switched the context from spiritual practice to the nature of an enlightened person who has transcended all that. And it's up to us to be alert when we're studying a scripture so that we can discern correctly the change of context. If you're not that skilled in reading a text, that's why we have classes, right? You have a class with a teacher, a guru, who does have that skill, is able to discern. Not surprisingly, Uddhava didn't get it. Uddhava failed to make that discernment, and as a result, Uddhava became quite confused. So let us see Uddhava's response, his confusion. Uddhava vacha, vidhishcha pratishedhascha, vidhishcha pratishedhascha, negamohishwarasyate, avekshate ravindaksha, Avekshyate ravindaksha guram dosham cha karmanam. Gunam dosham karmanam. Vidhihi Uddhava Uvacha, he said. He is responding now to the last verse of the previous chapter. Uddhava says that vidhi and pratishedha. Vidhi is that which is scripturally ordained, things that you should do. You should meditate, you should pray, you should study scriptures. Pratishedha are things that you shouldn't do. You shouldn't lie, steal, hurt, etc. So these vidhis and pratishedhas, these injunctions and prohibitions, they are nigamaha. They come from scriptures. They come from scriptures. What scriptures? Hi ishvarasya. They come from scriptures which are ordained, as it were, by Ishvara, the God of the cosmos. And Uddhava is very clever here. Ishvarasya te. All of this has come from Ishvara. All of this has come from you, te. From you, O Krishna. You are that Ishvara. You are the mouth, as it were. The nice poetry that's used very often. You are from your divine mouth. All the scriptures were uttered. And that's sort of the language that Uddhava is referring to here. Meaning that all the commandments in the scriptures, I shouldn't call them commandments. An injunction is something that you do for a purpose. And that is, if you want spiritual growth, these are things you should do. If you want spiritual growth, there are other things you shouldn't do. All of this is enumerated in the scriptures as taught by Ishvara, coming from the mouth of the Lord, coming from the mouth of Sri Krishna in this sense. Then in the second half, Aravinda Aksha is addressing Sri Krishna as one whose Aksha, whose eyes are like Aravinda, like lotus petals. One whose eyes are as beautiful as lotus petals is Aravindaksha. O Krishna, avekshate. All of these scriptures that come from you, everything that comes from you, avekshate is with regard to. It concerns what? And now we get into another list. First thing it concerns is guna dosham cha karmanam. For all of the karmas, for any deed you commit, is that deed guna or dosham? Here's a discernment. Is that deed, so in American English, good or bad? I always stop, though, when I try to use those words. I can't use those words because they're meaningless. The English words good and, this sounds funny to say, the English words good and bad are indeed meaningless. If good and bad had meaning, it should mean the same for everyone, right? So if I talk about a rock means one thing for me. Does it mean something different for you? Rock is a rock. So rock is a meaningful word. What about good and bad? What is good for me may not be so good for you. You've heard me give the example. In India, they like to serve this Karela, this bitter gourd. Is bitter gourd good or bad? You might say, excellent. I might say, ick. Sometimes I like it. So here's the point then. You say it's good. I say, typical American response. You get my point? Good and bad are really not meaningful words, so I try my best not to use them. Better said, the word used here are guna and dosha. Guna is that which is, how about we retranslate it? Guna, virtues and defects. How's that? That's a good translation. Not all of my translations are so good. This one is okay. Notice I'm back to using good again. My gosh. How deeply ingrained this language is. Good and bad is one of the most fundamental measures that we use, and we use it constantly, and it is so arbitrary. Here I've translated it virtues and defects, or what's even better, I think, that which is beneficial and that which is not beneficial. Much better. So here, guna is what is beneficial, dosha is what is not beneficial. And here the first category he is talking about, Uddhava is talking about, is the category of karma. Karmas can be beneficial, karmas can be not beneficial. Going to work can put food on your table. Not going to work and stealing money from a bank can put you in jail. So one action is beneficial, another action is not beneficial. That's true in a worldly sense, it's true in a religious sense. Doing certain rituals might be beneficial. Avoiding certain harmful deeds, religious defilement, would be unbeneficial from a religious standpoint. And then from a spiritual standpoint, we have a worldly standpoint, religious standpoint, and a spiritual standpoint. From a spiritual standpoint, certain deeds are beneficial for spiritual growth, like coming to class. Other things are not beneficial to spiritual growth, like not coming to class. So here, but, excuse me, Sri Krishna has just obliterated all these differentiations at the end of the last chapter, and that has totally confused Uddhava. So now he's talking about, what about this differentiation with regard to karma? Isn't it important? It's important for one who's not yet enlightened. For one who is enlightened, if they want to sit on a pile of dung, okay. If they want to eat fish, okay. If they truly are enlightened, as those examples gave. Then Uddhava goes on to give some other problematic areas. Varna shrama vikalpam cha, varna shrama vikalpam cha, pratilomanulomajam, pratilomanulomajam, dravya deshavaya kalan, dravya deshavaya kalan, swargam narakam cha, swargam narakam cha. So other areas in which we make these divisions or discernments, like with regard to the vikalpam, the separation of various varna and ashrama. Varna in modern times is translated as caste. Do you belong to the brahmanas, kshatriyas, vaishyas, shudras, or otherwise? And also ashrama, which stage of life are you in? Are you a student? Are you a householder? Are you retired? Are you a sannyasi? These are the traditional ancient culture, which Sri Krishna is referring to. You need to discern which stage of life you are in and which group you belong to, because those discernments determine your individual dharma, swadharma. What are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to go to work in the morning, or are you supposed to go to the battlefield and fight the bad guys? Well, if you are a Vaishya, you're supposed to go to work in the morning. If you are a Kshatriya, you're supposed to, in modern times, there are battlefields. You go to the battlefield and fight and die. So according to your stage of life and according to the group you belong to, you have certain personal responsibilities. We all have personal. We don't the discernment today is not according to this ancient cultural reference. So this Varnashrama system was prominent 2,000 years ago. It is almost meaningless today. So it's an artifact of an ancient culture. So we could redefine it. What are your personal responsibilities? At home, there are certain tasks you do. There are certain tasks your spouse does. Well, that's good. You divide up the task. You have to discern what is your responsibility and what is the spouse's responsibility. If you fail to discern, nothing gets done. If both spouses say, I don't know, whose turn is it to do the dishes? I don't know. And the dishes sit in the sink for a week or two. And so this discernment is crucial to fulfilling personal responsibilities. Here's another artifact of an ancient culture. Pratiloma anuloma jam. Discernment between the offspring of marriages which are pratiloma, improper, and anuloma, proper. What is a pratiloma marriage? Is a marriage in which a man of a lower caste marries a woman of a higher caste. They're worried about things like that a lot. And then what is a conducive marriage? A normal marriage is one in which a man of a higher caste can take a wife of a lower caste. To a modern ear, that sounds, absurd, silly. What is this about? Well, if you lived 2,000 years ago, it wouldn't sound absurd to a modern ear. Definitely it does. So we have to understand that there are marriages which are conducive to, the reference is actually not to the marriage, but to the offspring of the marriage. Jam is the affix here. So are offspring affected by the nature of the marriage? Yeah. Suppose husband and wife fight like cats and dogs. Does that affect the offspring? You bet it does. Big time, tremendously. If they're divorced, in this country, what is the divorce rate? Does that affect the children? Absolutely. How can it not affect the children? So suppose we just kind of convert, I tend to call this a cultural translation. You take a principle from ancient times and look for a related principle in modern times. So there's a discernment amongst marriages and the children born of those marriages, children born of a healthy marriage and children born of a dysfunctional marriage. And Uddhava's point is, should we just ignore that? Does it make any difference if parents fight like cats and dogs or if they live together happily ever after? No, we have to make that discernment, is Uddhava's point. And then he goes on, he says, what about dravya, material things, stuff? Should we discern the difference between gold and dirt? Well, there's a practical reason to discern the difference. Should we just ignore that? By the way, what about the enlightened person? Do you think dung Krishnananda cared about dung, about gold or dirt? You give him some dirt, he's happy. You give him some gold, he's happy. So he is beyond that discernment. But here, Uddhava's questions are from the level of sadhana. What about desha, place? So certain places are holy, sacred, temple, ashram. Other places, not so much so. How about a cemetery or burning grounds are not so auspicious? Should we discern or not? What about vayas, age? So is there any difference between being young and healthy or old and tired? Pretty big difference. How can we not discern? This is Uddhava's point. And kala, time, are a good example. Time of peace and time of war. Should we not discern the difference between? And finally, he gives one more example. What about discerning between Swarga and Naraka, between heaven and hell? Of course, from a practical standpoint, these have to be discerned, but Sri Krishna's comment, his teaching at the end of the prior chapter, is that one who is truly enlightened is beyond all such discernment, even heaven and hell, because the enlightened person goes at death neither to heaven nor to hell. The enlightened person remains non-separate from Brahman at the end of life, remains vast, full, complete. Even if you go to heaven, they make jokes out of this. What are the problems if you go to heaven? In fact, my guru used to make a really silly joke out of this. So you go to heaven and you get your own palace. But somebody else has a bigger palace on a higher hill. And you get, even in heaven, I suppose there could be such a thing as jealousy and other problems. All right. Uddhava continues. Guna dosha bhede drishtim, guna dosha bheda drishtim, antarena vachastava, antarena vachastava, nishreyasam katam nrnam, nishreyasam katam nrnam, nishedha vidi lakshanam, nishedha vidi lakshanam. So Uddhava now wants to make his argument about not, what do they say, American expression, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, getting rid of all these distinctions. He says, guna dosha bheda drishtim antarena. Guna dosha bheda antarena. If you have a drishti, a point of view, a perspective, which is antarena, which is without guna dosha bit, difference, without discerning the difference between what is beneficial, what is not beneficial, what is helpful, what is not helpful, what is good in quotation marks and what is bad in quotation marks. If we have a perspective which is devoid of all of that which is vachaha tava, which is based on your own teachings. Remember, Uddhava looks at Sri Krishna not merely as his cousin. They are cousins. But for Uddhava, Sri Krishna is much more than a cousin, Ishvara, as he said in a prior verse. So from Uddhava's standpoint, it is from, to use the metaphor I used before, from Krishna's mouth, the scriptures came forth at the beginning of time. So all of this is based on your teachings. What kind of teachings? Skip down to the last line. Your teachings which are nishedha vidhi lakshanam. Your teachings which are based on what should be done, what should not be done, what is helpful to do, what is not helpful to do. And again, from all three perspectives. From a worldly perspective, what should or should not be done. From a religious perspective, what should or should not be done. From a spiritual perspective, what should or should not be done. And now Uddhava makes his point. If we throw away all those distinctions, maybe with the bathwater, then in the third line, nrnam, for all people, katam nishreyasam, how will they find what is best if you obliterate all these differences? Well, Uddhava has misunderstood that Sri Krishna's negation of all these distinctions was not meant nrnam, for all people in general. He was describing enlightened people. And Uddhava didn't catch it, so to speak. Of course, Sri Krishna didn't help. He didn't say, by the way, I'm going to change perspectives right now. Generally, we don't do that in conversations. And even in scriptures, I've commented before, scriptures would be so much easier to read if they had paragraphs and what are they? These headings. Like in a modern academic book, you have all these headings. Now we're going to talk about this. Now we're going to talk about that. Now we're going to talk about that. It's not there. Commentaries help a lot, but it's not in the text themselves. So Uddhava here is thoroughly confused, but his point is well taken. For common people, nr-nam, for common people to throw away all these distinctions, katam nishreyasam. How will people discern what is best? And then he starts to conclude. Pitradeva manushyanam, Pitradeva manushyanam, Vedas chakshusthaveshvara, Vedas chakshusthaveshvara, Shreyastvanupalabdherte, Shreyastvanupalabdherte, Sadhya sadhanayorapi. Sadhya sadhanayorapi. In the second line, Ishvara, O Lord, he addresses Sri Krishna. He says, Tava Vedaha and Chakshus. Tava Vedaha, what is known by you, and what is chakshus, what is seen by you, what is understood by you. What is understood by you with regard to first line, Pitra, the ancestors, Devam, the gods in heaven, Manushyanam, and for people in general, you understand, O Krishna, you understand what is Shreyas in the third line. You know very well what is Shreyas. Prior verse, he said that if you throw away all these distinctions, you're going to deny people the opportunity to find what is best. But you know Shreyas too, but you know what is best. And further, you have that chakshus, you have that eye, that ability to understand anupalabdhe arte. You have the ability to understand arte with regard to things which are anupalabdhe, which are imperceptible, things that we cannot know on our own. Our knowledge is limited to our five senses, what we can see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. Based on our five senses, what do you personally know about heaven and hell? You know from Scripture, but what do you, in terms of your own experience, we know nothing. Our experience doesn't reach beyond our five senses and the sixth sense, which is mind. So because our perception is limited, there are so many things we don't know, but for Sri Krishna, his perception is Ishvara. His perception is not limited. He knows everything. Sarvagnya, the one who knows everything. And because he is Sarvagnya, that's why the scriptures metaphorically come from his mouth. So all of that, you know, O Krishna, you know everything. In the last line, Sadhya sadhana yoho api. You know everything about what is sadhya, what is to be gained, and what is sadhana, how to get it. You know everything. You know how to live a good life from a worldly standpoint. You know how to live a good life from a worldly a religious standpoint. You know how to live a good life from a spiritual standpoint. So why are you throwing away all these distinctions? Again, this is Uddhava's misunderstanding. We'll just see one more verse, but let me make an important comment here. Many times we've talked about this one technical term, which I find so helpful and so under-discussed, ignored in most religious and spiritual discourse. And it is, I used it earlier today in our I think in the meditation session. Adhikari Bheda. I forget what session. So the Bheda in the meditation session, the Bheda, this distinctions between adhikaris, between individual practitioners. This is such an important part of the Hindu teachings. It's interwoven into all the teachings, but not explicit, which is why we need to discuss it now and why we are discussing it now. Not explicit means, how do we know if Sri Krishna is talking about discernment meant for everyone versus discernment for the enlightened? How do we know? We have to know. We have to understand. If we fail to, we're failing to apply this principle of adhikari bheda, a principle that says different, I'll make it very clear, different teachings are meant for different people. So, teachings of mathematics are meant for children. Teachings of geometry and algebra meant for older children. Teachings about trigonometry and calculus are made for maybe young adults. Teachings of advanced mathematics, differential equations, transform mathematics, matrix theory, all of this, I don't know if it's made for any of us. It's break your head. But there are adhikari. What does it take to be an adhikari for the advanced mathematics? If you study all the other stuff, you're ready for it. That's just it. The problem comes when we mix up these different categories. You try teaching differential calculus to a 7-year-old. Good luck. It won't work. Just as bad, you try teaching long division to a college student. They'll say, you're nuts. I just use this calculator. Why do I need to worry about long division? Seriously, does anyone know how to do long division anymore? I don't think so. Yes. The point is that it's crucial to know that specific spiritual teachings are meant for specific groups of people. It's not one size fits all. And this is so important to recognize because people love to, there's just one verse left, so I'm just going to go on for a minute and then we'll finish the text. People love to criticize other groups. So suppose a follower of Advaita Vedanta analyzes the teachings of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. They hold that there is an eternal realm in which Sri Krishna, Radha, and all the gopis are having an eternal Raslila. In American English, an eternal party. Great party. When did it begin? Never began. When will it end? It will never end. It's been going on for all eternity, and it will continue for all eternity. And your job is to get there, get to the party. What's the address? Plug it into your Google Maps. It, Goloka Vrindavan, they call it. And if you plug that into your Google Maps, you're not you're not going to get any directions. So suppose an Advaita Vedantin learns about these teachings and that this is all childish, this is absurd. What is this all about? Do you see the error in thinking there? It's failing to recognize adhikari bheda. So according to your perspective as an Advaitin, it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. Fine, it's not meant for you. Any more than differential equations, Fourier theories, Fourier transforms, and matrix theory is not meant for you. Neither is Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And further, for these Gaudiyas, Advaita Vedanta is not suitable. They are focused on bhakti. To cultivate bhakti, everything they do is focused on cultivating bhakti. Bhakti is emotion. Advaita is not an emotion. You don't feel oneness. It's a reality. The reality of what is. It's not an emotion. Emotions are transient. They come and go. Advaita can't be an emotion. It doesn't come and go. So for these followers of this Gaudiya tradition, this Advaita Vedanta is not helpful. The problem comes when the Advaitin calls them childish, or they call Advaita ungodly, and worse, worse things they've called it. What's the point of this name calling if we understand the divisions here, this adhikari bheda? What they have is wonderful for them, effective for them, immensely helpful for them. And what one who follows Advaita Vedanta, what is given to us, is absolutely as helpful and as important, as crucial. So let's recognize the importance of this adhikari bheda. Okay, we'll finish our class today with the end of Uddhava's question, and then we'll see Sri Krishna's response in the following class. Uddhava concludes his question. Guna dosha bheda drishtir, guna dosha bheda drishtir, nigamate nahi swataha, nigamate nahi swataha, nigamenapavarascha, nigamenapavarascha, bhedaya itiha brahmaha, Vedaya itiha brahmaha. Guna dosha bheda drishtihi. This drishti, this perspective, worldview. Drishti is literally seeing. But here we need a bigger context, so worldview, the way of thinking, perspective. So this perspective, which is guna dosha bhit, which is based on division of what is beneficial and what is non-beneficial, again, at a worldly level, religious level, and at a spiritual level, these divisions, nigamat, they come from a source. And what is that source? They come from you, O Krishna, from your divine mouth. The blessed words of the scriptures come. Nahi swataha. These divisions don't come from the things themselves. And this goes back to that Karela. So Karela doesn't, if Karela could talk, would it say, I'm good or I'm bad? I'm tasty or I'm undesirable. So it's not inherent. Good or bad is not inherent in the Karela. And in the same way for spiritual practices. Is eating fish good or bad? Well, if you're this enlightened person on the beach trying to save some fish, then it's good. But if you're his disciples having a nice dinner, then it's not good for the fish anyway. It's maybe good for them. Or is it good to sit on a pile of dung to meditate? Depends. You get the point. So it's not that the dung determines whether it's helpful or not for meditation. These divisions come from outside. And what Uddhava's point is, they come from Scripture, and Scripture comes from you, O Krishna. And then he concludes, Nagamena apavadahacha, but if there is the apavada negation, refutation, if you refute all of these spiritual teachings which have come down, then if there is refutation, bhidayaha, of all these distinctions, if all these distinctions are refuted, itiha brahmaha, then there will be Brahma confusion. Certainly there's plenty of Brahma confusion for Uddhava, because Uddhava failed to appreciate what we just discussed, adhikari bheda. So for Gaudiya Vaishnavas, what they're doing is wonderful. By the way, that's a group, that Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition is a tradition from which ISKCON evolved. So if you saw years, yeah, they still do, but years ago they were quite visible in airports and elsewhere, running around and chanting with the kartal and all of this stuff, and chanting Hare Krishna, all of this stuff. Chances are you or somebody you know looked at them and thought they were pretty weird, right? Is that a fair judgment? Interesting. It's not a fair judgment. They are following in the footsteps of this ancient tradition. Now, it probably won't work for you, or definitely not for me. You won't see me. You won't see me out. But there's nothing wrong in it. For them, it's wonderful. For me, it's not. Fine. You might like Karela, and I don't. What's the problem? Do you criticize people? You don't like Karela? What's wrong with you? That doesn't make sense. But tell me, when you saw those Hare Krishnas dressed funny, dancing, and chanting Hare Krishna, when you said out loud or said silently, weird. Ye pagal hai. These guys are crazy. That is not fair. It is not an appropriate judgment if we really understand this principle of adhikari bheda. And that's exactly what Sri Krishna is going to address in his answer. He's going to show how different spiritual practices are meant for different people. Different scriptures are meant for different people. This is all adhikari bheda. That's our next topic. Okay, quick announcements. Tomorrow we have our Vedanta class, Shankara's great text, Upadesha Sahasri, at 10 o'clock. Come and join us. Followed at 11 o'clock by satsang question answers. So come with your questions. We'll conclude with our prayers. Om Gananahan tva Ganapatigam avamahe Kaving Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashrinvan Uttavasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.